Minimo, Morrisey and MP3. Almost 7 years had passed since the first notes of Allo Minimo were recorded, and I eventually released it at the start of 2010. It had been ready for almost 2 years, but the death of my dad had taken the wind out of my sails. It meant I wasn't as excited as I should have been. When I say release it, I mean I got it pressed and I made it available to those who wished to find it. I was very proud of the record and wanted it to be heard and purchased, but to be honest, the whole song and dance of sending it out, trying to get it reviewed and organising interviews meant I couldn't really be asked. Over the years, I've gained a small group of admirers in the media, and getting the album to them and getting them to back it was pretty easy, as I had personal relationships with these people. I knew there'd be a small fan base of people who would buy it, and as long as it sold, even in small numbers, then that'd justify recording it in the first place. Internet distribution was much better than when Ripe and Le Grand Fromage had come out, and making it available on iTunes and Amazon would be good enough for me. As long as I could direct people towards hearing it, then the music could stand on its own merit. The songs didn't fall into any current music category, and it'd still sound contemporary in 5 years' time, so I didn't see the urgency of trying to promote it like I'd done with the previous albums. This meant I lost out in terms of making people aware that it existed, but I knew the lifespan of the album would be a few years, and as long as it sold steadily, then that was fine. The first two albums had continued to sell despite being released 10 years before, so why would Allo Minimo be any different? My attitude to being a professional musician had changed a little too. I realised now that I was too old to compete with the young bucks with six packs, and my chances of making the big time were drastically reduced. I'm not trying to compare myself to the great man, but Van Gogh painted because he could paint. Did he sit down knocking out sunflowers thinking to himself, "This one's a fucking belter, it's gonna make me a fortune"? No, he did it because he could, and he saw it as his only route to making a living. I'd been making music because I could, and any comparison with the great artist ends there. I had a studio, it cost me little to produce, and I still enjoyed the creative process and playing, but I really couldn't be bothered promoting an album in the conventional sense. I'd do gigs where they came up, and I'd promote it via the new social networks of MySpace and Facebook. Although Niall had returned to these shows, Dan had stayed at home, so my band was undisposed unless I recruited a new bass player, and that seemed like a lot of work for a handful of shows. Besides which, a lot of the new material was suited to me promoting it acoustically, so if any gigs came up, then I'd do them on my own. I'd been using MySpace for a few years, and its inception had given bands a global stage to air their music. Within an hour, you could create your profile and upload your music. The fledgling technology that we'd used to make Frankie records was now available to anyone with a computer, so it was feasible to write a song, create a band, and have it out on the web in 24 hours if you wanted to. The integrated media player on your MySpace profile page meant that people were a click away from hearing your music. There was no effort browsing music profiles and clicking here and there to check out new music. It was a global indie record store. It interfaced with companies like CD Baby, so potential customers were only 2 clicks away from buying it. It went a long way to leveling the playing field. One could have the same profile and exposure as someone with a promotion budget of millions if you could get people to your page. I'd been blogging for years but didn't have the necessary web skills to do anything more than paste me words onto a page and upload it. MySpace enabled you to embed videos on your profile, and my blogs became more of a multimedia experience with pictures and YouTube clips. I began using it to promote my music. People across a wide age group from all over the world bought me albums. It worked. This'll do for me. Of course, the major labels got onto it, late as usual, and tried to skew things back in their favour. It wasn't unusual to hear stories of labels hiring 30 kids to sit in front of a computer and hammer MySpace all day to promote their latest charges. Pun intended, again. Everyone on MySpace, musicians and everyday users, had the means to embed a track from their favourite artist on their page, and this would begin playing as soon as the page opened. So, one kid clicks on a mate's page, hears a track, likes the track, adds it to his page, and so on and so on. This meant hot bands could go viral and become very popular very quickly. For example, the Arctic Monkeys gave away free tracks via the internet and became huge without help from a major label. I say that, but I was also told they had an army of internet monkeys behind them too. I'd like to think that the former is true and the band's success was all down to them and the popular tunes. The media player on your page also told you how many plays you were getting. It was exciting to put a track up and watch the counter climb. It was also a great way to gauge your most popular tunes. I'd listened to me new material for years now and had no opinion, and it was interesting getting feedback. My lesser favourites would sometimes be more popular than what I thought were more commercial songs. What do I know? The logging of plays turned MySpace into a numbers game, and the majors would sign up anything that was showing signs of mass appeal. This was a new music industry, and the old guards were slow catching on. The MP3 format had been around for years, and instead of embracing it, the majors initially tried to stop it. File sharing meant you could get music for nothing. Free music meant no profit. No profit is no good for the business. Even today, they're still bleating about being ripped off despite having over 1 billion legal downloads a year. I'll freely admit to stealing music. I stole everything I'd bought on vinyl and cassette in the last 20 years. The way I see it, I've already paid at least once. For example, I bought Dark Side of the Moon on vinyl for my parents' stereogram, then on cassette so I could listen on my Sony Walkman, and then ended up forking out 18 quid for a remastered anniversary CD for me separate hi-fi. And you're the ones being ripped off? If I were ever prosecuted, I think I'd have a defence strategy. I'd willingly pay the labels for my stolen music if I were recompensed for the music that I've made that's been stolen by others. There are loads of Frankie files and some Nasher ones floating about on file sharing websites, and I'm not being paid for them changing hands. A fair exchange is no robbery. It probably wouldn't stand up in a court of law though. The people putting out the music own the format it's played on. I don't believe Apple have any real interest in the music industry and just see iTunes as a way of delivering cheap software for their expensive hardware. The music industry tried to kill vinyl with cassettes, then reduced it to a niche market with CDs, and have now eventually embraced the MP3 format. Vinyl's fighting back and is getting more popular. Why? Because it sounds fucking great. How did he pull that one off? They convinced us all, didn't he? I no longer own a record player, but the last 3 times I've heard vinyl in somebody's house, it sounded fantastic. Pristine vinyl coupled with a good amplifier and deck sounded as good, if not better, than the new digital formats. Everybody my age misses the album sleeve, if only because they had sufficient surface area to support all the accoutrements required for skinning up. I'd pore over the detail on sleeves when I was younger. Big, sexy gatefold sleeves by Hypnosis and Roger Dean. Who mixed it, where it was recorded, who played on it. All that's gone now, replaced with an airbrushed JPEG of the artist, barely visible on the front of your chosen media player. I think the other reason people of my age mourn the loss of the album is because the credits on CDs are too bloody small to read with our diminishing eyesight. The money that was once used to manufacture, package and distribute is now profit. How much does it cost to send an MP3 to iTunes? A lot less than sending a lorry full of albums around the country. The lack of record sleeves didn't stop the companies from charging the artists for packaging deductions. Work that one out. A packaging cost for something with no package. There's a clause in our ZTT contract that allows them to retain 15% of royalties for breakages and returns. This goes back to the days of 78 when they'd suffer damage in transit. Breakages are still applied to today's so-called indestructible CD format. The record companies love to throw out the old line that file sharing is stealing from the artist. Really? There's VAT payable on music, so if you download a track for free, you're stealing twice the amount from the government than you are from the artist. I think most people would see screwing the government for a few quid as a good thing, wouldn't they? A way of clawing back a little for what they take from us. If the digital thief likes the track, then he or she may turn up to a concert and you'll get £10 from them, which is better than the 10 pence you're getting from the label for your download. They may even buy a t-shirt and put your profit up further. Of course, the labels know that now and try to take a slice of the artist's live revenue in what are known as 360 deals. I've no qualms about nicking the odd track from a major label, but it's different when it's an independent artist. I downloaded a couple of albums by a band I discovered by accident and loved the music so much I tracked them down on the internet and sent them the money. It had been 25 years since Welcome to the Pleasure Dome had been released, and ZTT marked the occasion with another re-release with a load of other tracks on it. I didn't know about it until it was out. I only got a copy when I contacted Salvo, the licensee, and asked them to send me one. It contained a few unreleased recordings and demos to entice the hardcore Frankie fan. There are several completists among the Frankie fanatics I have met and befriended over the years. They got hooked in the 80s by the multiple remixes, and that instigated their Frankie habit. I think some would buy an album of farts and saxophones if it had Frankie Goes to Hollywood down the spine. I would have objected to some of the tracks on the album, but it was too late to do anything about it when it was already out. The inclusion of some rarities was enough to ensure a decent level of sales and made the release worthwhile. All costs would be recouped from us, so they stood to lose very little. The only contact I had regarding the release was when I was asked if I'd do some promotion. Course I would. I tell you what, while I'm promoting it, I could bend over and clean your shoes and still be able to sweep the floor with a brush up my arse. I declined the offer. Maybe I was cutting my nose off to spite my face, but I knew I wasn't going to do anything for them. In the previous year, I'd started to help me mate Phil Harris record some old songs he'd written with Steve Broughton. I'd met Phil via Steve 10 years previously and we'd become good pals. I used to play cribbage with him once a week and would spend many nights in his company watching sport on telly or listening to him play ragtime guitar. He had a lovely touch and a magic guitar on which to display it. Many times I'd noodle away on his old Martin guitar and I'd come up with an idea. It was magic. Phil had cut his musical teeth with Paul Carrick in the 70s with a band called Ace. A lot of people don't know the band, but they all know the worldwide hit How Long. He was one of my best mates and that's why I agreed to get involved. I was helping Phil and Steve as much as I could, but I had enough on my plate with my own music, so it was a blessing when Phil met a guy called Mickey Portman and he got involved in the project. I was delighted because it meant it was someone fresh, with more impetus than I, pushing the project along. I'd pop in on sessions and play the odd bit of bass and guitar and help with the arrangements, but I wasn't involved as much as I had been. I'd recorded Phil many times, and as much as I loved him, it was hard work. A greater player as he was, he'd fuck up when I put him into record. It was the worst case of red light syndrome I've ever seen. He would sit there and play something perfectly, but as soon as the record light came on, he'd crumble and lose time or play a bum note. Mickey did a lot of TV work providing music for shows and had done a few movies as well. And as I was leaving his house after a session, he asked me if I'd help him out with a show he was doing. He's worked on several projects with a TV production company providing the backing music, and he was due to be involved in a new show for ITV called Men Brewing Badly. It would feature Neil Morrisey and his pal Richard Fox travelling the length of Africa in a van carrying beer from their own brewery. They would sample some local brews and distribute their own beer on the way. The journey would culminate in them arriving in South Africa for the 2010 World Cup and delivering some beer to the England fans. Henry Cole, the show's producer, has suggested a theme song for the show based on The Lion Sleeps Tonight, but changing the lyric to 3 lions. Mickey told me the brief and wanted me to get involved in the recording. He and his partner Vince knew nothing about football and would need some help in the lyric department. I thought it sounded like the worst idea in the world and thought nothing would ever come of such a crap idea, but weeks later he pressed me again and told me it was game on. I went out to his flat and we started work by listening to the original. It was a pretty simple melody and it wasn't difficult for me to write a lyric replacing the original words with England footballers' names. I inserted England's on the way in place of the opening wail and we were up and running. I wrote the words in less than 10 minutes and sang them over Mickey's big drums, and by the end of the day we had a decent enough version to know whether we were on the right track. Henry gave us the thumbs up and we began polishing it before arranging a day up at my studio with Neil and Foxy. I sent a rough version to Adrian Bushby and he agreed to do the mix. We could be onto something here. A sing-along footy song featuring Mr. TV Gold with a guarantee of it being aired every week on ITV. Neil and Foxy were lovely guys, and when the session was over, they recorded a little improv sketch for Aid's son, who was a huge fan of Bob the Builder. Neil was pretty relaxed doing the vocals because of his experience doing voiceovers for adverts and singing on the Bob the Builder records. I wasn't the only one with 3 number ones under his belt. Foxy was a little less tuneful. Neil delivered a decent performance and it was pretty good tuning wise, but it didn't have the swing and rhythm of my demo vocal, and I was wondering how we could repair it and make it passable. I'd been out of touch with studio technology and was gobsmacked when Vince ran Neil's vocal through Melodyne. I'd never seen it before, but this software enabled you to manipulate the vocal to a ridiculous degree. Moving, tuning and elongating words could be done with a click and a drag. Vince matched the timing and tuning of Neil's vocal to mine, and it sounded great. The worst idea in the world suddenly looked like it had potential to be sung from the stands in South Africa. Aid mixes it and it is walloping. It sounds like a hit record, a cheesy one admittedly, but a hit nonetheless. Who was going to put it out? I suggested my cousin John Rice should shop it. He'd been in the industry nearly 20 years and knew a load of top people at all the majors, but the offer was declined and Henry took on the job of sorting out the release himself. I hear from Mickey that Henry's lined up some guy who runs Johnny Depp's label. The first thing I do is Google it, and the only thing I find is a rumour about a label on a Johnny Depp forum. Mickey was so enthusiastic about it, I found it very hard to piss on his chips, but I kinda knew from that point that the project was fucked. It's always the way. As soon as a project moves out of the hands of the people that created it out of love, then all other outside involvement exists because they can see a shilling in it. That usually being the case, it was bizarre that Henry would choose a guy who runs a non-existent record label over trying to get it out on a major. Boom. Torpedo 1. I've never met the guy who was behind the release, and he might be a good guy for all I know, so I guess I should exonerate him. I have 1 copy of the CD single, so the guy did get it out. The show's filmed and ITV don't appear to be that impressed with the result. It was due to be aired after a live World Cup match but was eventually relegated to ITV4. Boom. Torpedo 2 strikes home. When I eventually saw the show, I could understand their thinking. It was pretty dire. Boom. Torpedo 3. Abandoned ship. Game over. Our terrace anthem was dead in the water. I think the idea for the show sounded pretty good, but the reality was far from convincing. It seemed to be wedged between trying to be an informative cultural documentary and a light-hearted comedy about 2 lads larking about in Africa. The arse sat on neither stool. I watched the first 2 episodes but tuned out after that. I'd broken me promise not to succumb to outside influences and I should have stuck to me guns. If I'd have done the record on my own, then maybe I would have, but I had to think of the other musicians involved and keep my mouth shut. Still, the record was out. It exists. There's a video and a performance on GMTV to mark its passing if you care to look, although I wasn't around for the video shoot. To date, I don't know how many copies it sold despite numerous requests. Another penniless experience for the memory bank. I guess the lives of most aspiring musicians are filled with disappointment. I feel incredibly privileged to have had some degree of success, but the latest failure made me think about what information I could impart to other musicians. Were there any lessons to be learned for those who'd follow? I'd been blogging for a few years and had good responses to my cyber ranting and decided I should start writing down some of my experiences. I went back to the windmills in Jersey and wrote the first instalment of this book. I enjoyed the experience and planned 2 more trips the following year. There were times when I was recounting some of the earlier Frankie tales that I had tears streaming down my face with laughter. Would the new literary adventure go the same way of most of my recent musical projects? Well, I'll deem it a success if I see someone reading it at an airport. Let's see. Phil and Steve's music was coming along, but Phil needed to have an operation on his bladder. He'd been having some problems and needed the op, so the project was suspended for a while until he was on the mend. I visited him a few times in hospital, and despite not being the best patient, he suffered in near silence, and the operation was deemed a success. I saw him the day before he was due to be released when I took him in a radio so he could listen to his beloved Arsenal that night. He couldn't wait to get out. I left promising to call round the next day when he was back at home to see if he needed anything. I was woken the next morning by a phone call from Phil's neighbour, Arunas. Phil was dead. I couldn't believe it. He was on top form and looking well when I'd seen him 12 hours earlier. I called his daughter Sally, knowing she'd be distraught. She told me he'd suffered a heart attack due to a clot. It had happened in his sleep and he'd not suffered. This was no consolation to me. I felt robbed. Sally asked me to speak at his funeral. There were many people there who had known Phil longer than I and were probably more qualified to do the job, but I was asked and I was honoured to oblige. I'd lost some good friends over the years, but none as close to me as Phil. Every time I see a great Arsenal goal, or hear news of them on the radio, or see any of the many sports he watched on TV, he always pops into my mind. He was a sports fanatic. I remember him calling me late one night to tell me, "Brian, I'm a fucking sad bastard. I've sat in front of the telly watching sport all day, and I've only just found out that Saddam Hussein's been found." Phil's music is on hold, but we'll get around to finishing the project at some point. But at the moment, hearing his voice or his guitar playing, and knowing he isn't standing behind me criticising both, means it's hard to complete. It was almost 30 years since I'd joined Frankie. You'd think that all possible legal wrangles would have been explored by now, wouldn't you? You're wrong.